Hello again, and welcome back to the fourth video in this series on the political economy of the American Empire. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Indigenous experience, or what's better defined as policies towards Native Americans from the reservation system onwards. So I mentioned this at the end of my last video, but I couldn't really find a great required reading or required video to watch that's on the more, academic side of this topic. The only thing I found, was about, a series of legal decisions, and I didn't really want to assign that. So instead, I asked my students to watch a documentary. It's called A Good Day to Die, about the life of Dennis Banks, one of the primary organizers of the American Indian movement. So if you're interested, I encourage you to watch it. But it's more of a representation of what was it like to actually live under these government policies. So yeah, if you're interested, I encourage you to watch it. But I cover everything that needs to be covered in the slides, so that should be fine even if you don't watch it. And the last thing I'll mention here is, it's really hard to find one source like to cover particularly all of this topic. There's at least scholarship on, what the policies towards Black Americans from slavery onward, but in terms of policies towards Native Americans, the scholarship is kind of on particular topics. So what I've done is I've had to do a lot of research and piece this together. And, I hope this brings some clarity to it. And, personally, I thought it was one of the most interesting things that I got a chance to learn about while creating this course. So I'm excited to get to talk about this. And now I will go ahead and get started, and I will share my screen. All right, so to begin with, oops, there we go. I'm going to do this lecture, and then I'll kind of go over the discussion like I normally do. So, I won't actually talk about these questions very much because they're mostly just to get my students to think about, what's covered in the film, and, asking about what was the experience of Dennis Banks and why did the American Indian movement form? What were their aims? But, I'm going to jump right into kind of an overview of the documentary. So it covers the life of Dennis Banks, and his childhood really begins with the Native American boarding school system. So he's forced into the boarding school system where the intention is to, and the actual words they use are kill the Indian, save the man. So it's trying to take the Native Americans away from their culture and, quote unquote, Americanize them. And, this begins in the 1860s, but it continues all the way to the 1970s. So it's quite incredible how long this went on. Native Americans also were forced into urban settings without job training or preparedness. So, once Dennis Banks, he leaves the boarding school system, he goes to the military, and then he goes and moves to the city. And, the documentary mentions this period of time in American policies towards Native Americans where they're pushed essentially into the cities. And I'll go into more detail on this later. But that's how Dennis Banks ends up in the urban environment. And what he sees there is, poverty and people being pushed into this environment without training or preparedness, and the extent of police brutality against Native Americans and their disproportionate incarceration. So because of this, because of poor legal protections, poor living conditions, it leads to the rise of the American Indian movement led by Dennis Banks. They fought for the recognition of treaties, treaty rights, improved living standards, and so on. And, the way they did this is through demonstrations and occupations at, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Mount Rushmore, Custer, North Dakota, Wounded Knee, and the documentary goes into all of this. AIM is disbanded largely after Wounded Knee, but, it has lasting effects on how opportunities were opened up for Native Americans and a real rebirth of Native American pride and widespread American awareness of these issues. So that is what the documentary covers. And what I'm going to get at today is the policies that led to, this experience, the policies behind it, and the economic reality, and how things have also changed or not changed since the American Indian movement. So to start understanding the relationship between the American government and tribes, you have to start really with the Trust Doctrine. So in 1887, the US Supreme Court has a ruling, and this is what they say. These Indian tribes are the wards of the nation. They are communities dependent on the United States, dependent largely for their daily food, dependent for their political rights, for their very weakness and helplessness, so largely due to the course of dealing of the federal government with them, and the treaties in which it has been promised, there arises the duty of protection. So acknowledging the history that they have with the tribes, which is, as we've talked about, been one of genocide and a push towards the reservation system, which was established in the 1850s, the government comes to acknowledge that they have a duty to the Native Americans, particularly they say because of the treaties that they have made. I'm thinking to myself because, this is what they say, but the intentions are really questionable. And we're going to go into that in a second. So with the establishment of a guardian ward or beneficiary trustee relationship between the government and the tribes, and the government promises to provide three things. One, the protection of Indian trust lands. That means the federal government oversees all lands that belong to the tribes, so the reservations, and they ensure that no one encroaches on that land. Of course, with the exception of the federal government itself. Two, they promise the protection of tribal sovereignty and rights of self-governance. And we're going to go into more detail on that in the next slide because it's quite interesting how this plays out. And three, the provision of basic social, medical, and educational services for tribal members, which interestingly enough is determined based off of blood quantum in the United States, which I'm not going to talk about it in detail here, but if you're interested, go look into that because that's something quite unique to this system, and it's quite controversial too. So let's look more closely at tribal sovereignty. So it's first important to acknowledge that tribal sovereignty predates the founding of the United States. The tribes are always governing themselves. So it's not this gift or special status the United States gives to the Native Americans, but it's always existed. And in fact, the relationship between the tribes and the United States started as one of, nations who would make treaties between one another. So you have to remember that. But when in 1887, the United States acknowledges tribal sovereignty in the Supreme Court ruling, they invent a new system of governance for the tribes, and that's one of tribal councils, which is a completely unique invention, and it rejected traditional Native Americans' governance structures and basically attempted to wipe them out. So what this did is it gave the councils, control over the tribe with pretty much no accountability. So there was no checks and balances. And at the same time, the government limited their authority. There were certain things they couldn't make rulings on, and a lot of it required government oversight. So many actions and all laws required approval from the Department of the Interior first. But they have no accountability to their people, to the people living on the reservation. And the United States government doesn't do a lot to protect those interests, right? In some cases. And then at the same time, federal lawsuits are consistently denied on the grounds of tribal sovereignty. So if you watch A Good Day to Die, there's a part where they talk about how there's a man who's tortured and brutally murdered, and the US government won't deal with it because they say it's a tribal issue because it was a Native American, and the tribal government won't deal with it because it didn't happen on a reservation. So eventually AIM has to step in and try to bring justice in this situation. But that is how it has played out. And then in regards to tribal councils, we know that from the beginning, the Bureau of Indian Affairs intervened in tribal council elections for decades. Today it's much more representative. Um, it's not the original system. Obviously, it's still the tribal council system. And um, at the same time, there's still some fraud that occurs. And if you look at news articles, there's still cases where, there's an abuse of power, but it's an improvement from how it started. And in regards to this, we get quotes like from the scholar Peter d'Errico, who he wrote that article from 2 videos ago about the Holocaust, right before it was in the slides right before the discussion. You might see it there. But he says about this, federal Indian law is the continuation of colonialism. On the basis of a non-sovereign tribal sovereignty, the United States has built an entire apparatus for dispossessing Indigenous peoples of their lands, their social organizations, and their original powers of self-determination. The concept of American Indian sovereignty is useful to the United States because it denies Indigenous power in the name of Indigenous sovereignty. So we see consistent critiques of this. And let's talk about, what are the general critiques or the reality actually of the Trust Doctrine? Well, okay, how does protection of Indian trust lands fare? So we know there's an exception for expropriation of land by the federal government. I mean, it's no wonder what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. At the same time, the US government put limitations on land use, and they required federal approval for any alterations or financing on the land. It became virtually impossible to own land on a reservation or to build wealth through, alteration of land or financing, which also scares away investors. So there's no economic investment into these communities. And then any income from land rental, which is when a tribe may, rent out some of their land to a corporation for resource extraction to get some money back to invest into the reservation. That money is collected directly by the US government, and then it's redispersed to the tribe and only allowed to be used for particular purposes. So there have been hundreds of lawsuits alleging billions of dollars in land leases that the US government hasn't paid out yet to Native Americans. And there have been some cases where actually justice has been done, but we've seen this consistently. Okay, so how does tribal sovereignty and self-governance look? Well, we talked about that. The council system established puppet governments with no checks on power. That's how you get the rise of people like Dick Wilson on Pine Ridge, the Pine Ridge Reservation, as seen in A Good Day to Die. And then the power ultimately lies in the hands of the federal government, which has complete oversight. Okay, how about basic social, medical, and educational services? Well, we know that services for Native Americans are chronically underfunded and inadequate. So, I'm going to show some statistics later on this, and we'll talk about this further. So, I'd like to read some quotes critiquing these systems. The first says, "The Trust Doctrine is a source of largely unrestrained federal power to regulate all aspects of tribal existence, from the management and disposal of Indian land and resources, to the imposition of federal criminal jurisdiction over tribal members, even the dissolution of tribal government. So the US government has the right to dissolve tribes, take away their rights to services, take away their acknowledgement and any sort of relationship," which they have done in the 1950s with termination, and I'll talk about that soon. Then we have another quote where it says, "American Indian sovereignty and federal Indian law is a tool for limiting the powers of Indigenous self-determination and for allowing the United States to determine the structure of Indigenous government." All right, so I feel like that gives you an idea. But I'd like to show this video, which is actually, it's from the 1970s, but it's the thoughts of a Muskogee Creek elder on these policies and the effect they've had on the tribes. So I'm going to give it a second to load.
To live by. And that's why we have many disagreements, we have many factions among our tribes, because we are practicing something that does not belong to us. But when we when we look back at the ancient government that we had, that government was workable for us, and it worked for us into thousands of years with no disagreement. So wherever I go and I meet traditional people, we have no problems. We don't have that much confusion in understanding the creation, understanding our religion. We don't have that much confusion. And I find that most everywhere I have been, everyone who has been Americanized have been confused, no matter what country it is. These countries that have been Americanized are confused, and I see that this society is very much confused to the extent that they cannot cross the street without getting run over, so they have to stop on the red light and go on the green one, because we live in a confused society. And we can take a look on simple things such as even food that we eat today. We have become so confused that we don't know what we're eating. All the instant food that we find on the shelves, we read the ingredients on there. The ingredients that has a word on there that goes plumb across the box there. What educated man knows what that means? With all the education that we have in our universities, we don't even know what that word means. But we're eating it. So actually, we don't even know what we're eating.
We're very removed.
Yes, we're so far removed from natural way of life. We don't know what we're eating. We don't know what we're drinking. We're just here. We had no need for no one to tell us how to live. We had a way of life, and there was nothing wrong with it. We have plans made for us. Ever since the days when they begin to make treaties with our ancestors, they begin to tell us how to live and how to act and what to do. There have been many, many laws made through Congress, reorganization acts, and so on, to better the lives of the Indian people. But these plans were not made by the Indians. The plans were made by someone who has never even seen an Indian, in Washington somewhere. The plans that was made for the Indians have all failed miserably. None of them has been workable. Even to this day, many different tribes have tried to use these programs. They have tried to use these reorganization acts, and it's still not working. Many of the programs that are available for us.
Okay. So I'm going to stop the video there. And now what I'd like to talk about is how are these policies actually carried out? Well, they're carried out through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was originally created in 1824 under the Department of War in order to assimilate Indians and fulfill treaties. It's historically been a non-native, self-serving bureaucracy, and there weren't many Native Americans working in the Bureau of Indian Affairs until the latter 20th century. Today it's 95% Native American, so it's more representative. So let's talk about how it functions though. A superintendent is appointed for each reservation, and they have entire control as a judge, police chief, banker, real estate agent, head of state, all wrapped into one, with control over resources. And no actions are taken without the approval of this US government representative, the superintendent. So while tribal councils hold, power over the laws they make and the decisions made on the reservation, ultimately the power lies in the hand of the superintendent and the federal government. So I've placed an image here from the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs by AIM. So what have been the areas of policy carried out by the Bureau? So pre-New Deal, there were broken treaties, boarding schools, the boarding school system I talked about, an assimilation doctrine, and in 1934, they released a new act called the Indian Reorganization Act, and it ends, the sale of land started with the Dawes Act, and a lot of these terrible actions. But at the same time, it instates that, structure of tribal sovereignty we talked about. The council system is finally put into place, really. So this fundamentally changes the structure of the tribes and how they function. And you can really say that, you know, the those genocidal policies sure were ended, but a new era of policy begins. By the 1950s and 60s, they really don't want to deal with, what's called quote unquote the Indian problem anymore. So termination policy means we're going to like basically end, any acknowledgement of the tribes. So they start by ending healthcare, and they end education, and they end tribal recognition for many tribes, and they try to push them into the cities for complete assimilation. And you can see this photo on the right hand side here that's from that era, trying to advertise so they can get more Native Americans to move to the city. Um, by the 1970s, the American Indian movement obviously is taking action to oppose, the terrible realities that are happening at that time. And by 1975, you get the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. So they end termination and they try to move from more of a management role for the reservations to an advisory role. And we're still under this era of policy. I want to focus more on termination and relocation because today, 78% of Native Americans live off the reservation. So, what's their reality looking like for them, and how did that happen? Well, with termination, they started this relocation program from the 50s through the 70s, and it essentially provides a one-way ticket to the city, and to some, it gives a stipend. They're often also relocated as far from the reservation as possible so that they have no way of getting back. They try to split up families because they see these families as a barrier to assimilation into American culture. And once they enter the cities, they face rampant racism. They're denied jobs. They're denied housing through redlining. They have to deal with police brutality. And it's essentially what's called a one-way ticket from rural to urban poverty by some scholars. And this is what, moves so many Native Americans off the reservation and brings them into these systems in the cities. All right. And by 1968, there's 40% unemployment, 50% high school dropout rate, a 44-year life expectancy as opposed to 70-year for the general US population. You see the rise of alcoholism, depression, and violence. And you're getting quotes from people like this BIA officer who are saying things like, well, I've always felt that the only real solution for the Navajo was to cease to be a Navajo, to get off the reservation and become a citizen just like everybody else, and make his living in the same way as other people. Forget that he is a Navajo, in other words. So, before I go into the economic section, I do want to bring something up, which is that, yes, in the 1970s, AIM really, changes some things, opens up opportunities, um, and at the same time, you know, for the reservations, we see some changes, like hunting and yeah, gaming are now open as an industry that the reservations can get into, which brings them a new source of revenue, albeit limited because they actually have to pay double taxes on it. So it's not as profitable as most people will think. But some things change and some opportunities opened up. But that doesn't mean that uh, that poverty didn't continue, that discrimination didn't continue. And hopefully the statistics I'm going to show right now will give you an idea of that. So the first thing I want to show is the statistic on the left-hand side. There's this common conception that Native Americans, particularly those living on the reservations, are just soaking up government funds and not contributing back. But I want to point out this is the per capita spending on the general US population, and this is the per capita US government spending per capita yeah, for the Native American population. So less money goes to each Native American versus each, general American in the population. So that's fundamentally, kind of a myth, right? So what are the realities that we see for these policies and how they play out? Well, here's the per capita income for all races. It's around $25,000. Here's the per capita income for Native Americans. It's around $15,000. And here's the per capita income for Native Americans on reservations. It's around $10,000. So you can see how these policies have played out. The same goes for education. I'm not going to go into all these statistics, but we see more likelihood to drop out, more likelihood to be suspended, more likelihood to commit suicide. All of these factors, and even lower performance in schools, across the board, because of disinvestment into Native American communities, but also the education system itself, we see worse outcomes for Native American populations. Same goes for health. Significantly higher pregnancy-related deaths for the Native American population. And during COVID-19, mortality is twice as high. So I hope that gives you an idea of how these have played out. And I'm not going to show this video, but I do want to point out that we see, continued innovation in these communities to find new ways to build up their communities, to reinvest in them, find new ways of supporting new generations and things like that, and continued resistance against what is, I guess you could call, continued colonization and land theft. So it's not to say that it's all terrible, but we do see, action being taken, hopefully, to change the situation. But at this point, I'd like to bring us to the discussion. And the question is, has the period of American colonialism truly ended? If it has not, how would liberation take place? And what does liberty really mean? Especially in a context where, I write here, how can justice and liberation be achieved with Native Americans living mostly off reservations? So we know that once off reservations, these discrepancies in outcomes continued. So how can there be some kind of intervention and some kind of liberty if it's not just, a free market system or a capitalist system that can support them? I think this is an interesting question to consider. So I'm going to stop there. And, that topic was quite a challenge for me to put together, but I also think it's fascinating and something that we don't often learn about. But the statistics show it best, the outcomes of these policies. Sorry, that's my cat. I'm going to stop there. And, in the next video, I'm going to be talking about post emancipation, post Reconstruction policies towards Black Americans. And, what would be the assigned video is a talk by the scholar Mehsa Baradaran on The Color of Money, which is her book regarding, all those policies. And she does a wonderful job of really covering, the entire breadth of policy and the economic effects. So I encourage you to go watch that, because when it comes to my video, I'm mostly going to be focusing not so much on that content-wise, but on raising, things to think about and topics of discussion. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much once again for listening.